Thank you everybody for joining this webinar, which is more of a conversation, a chat about communication and keeping your business and people connected in COVID and what we think has been happening, and then on into the future, what we all predict might happen. So a conversation at that point. Thank you very much, obviously, to the German British Chamber of Industry and Commerce for co-hosting and organising it, especially Silke, who's there. There is a Q&A facility, so please do use it and we'll answer questions at the end. And as I say, thank you for those of you who've started voting on the poll. We'll let you know about that as we go live. So I'm going to hand over now to our host, really, more than me, to kick this all off.
Okay, yeah. First of all, welcome from me, from Ulrich Hoppe. I'm the Director General of the German British Chamber. Most of you know me, but the ones who don't know me, a warm welcome to our webinar. Over the last few months, we've hosted a number of webinars in different formats, and what we found over the time is really that having a webinar, not just in terms of a PowerPoint presentation, but more in terms of a dialogue, so that we can actually learn from each other, learn from questions, and have some more real life examples and see how the flow goes, especially as you can ask questions in between. So it is a more dynamic format, which I think will help and answer most or many of your questions. And I think we're very grateful to Joanna Dott for being here today and sharing her insights in terms of communication, because I think it's a key issue in the COVID-19 crisis. Communication has changed. I mean, if I look at myself, so I used to do a lot of management by walking around, or communication by walking around, and that is no longer possible. So that I would just like to start off with my first question to Joanna Dott. Really, can you give us an introduction of your company, what you do, where your line of expertise is, because that will help us in terms of the flow of the conversation this afternoon. Joanna, over to you.
Oh, thank you. Yes, okay, so we're a PR and marketing consultancy, and we work for what we call market entry clients. So those would be international companies, brands coming into the UK, trading into or landing, at all stages of market entry. So we can see people just when they're starting to think about coming into the UK, right through to companies that have been here, established, maybe been here for several years. And often they haven't felt the need to do much communication, and that's when they get back in touch with us. So it's a very long, for us, market entry is a very long time frame, I suppose. In terms of sectors that we work across, very varied as well. A lot in tech, and I think that's a sector that's doing very well at the moment. A lot in tech, but we also do food and drink, lifestyle brands, a lot of services, everything from education, SaaS, legal, all sorts. So the work that we do is both business to consumer, corporate, crisis and reputation management. So hopefully in all of that spread, we will be able to cover off things that are relevant and useful to all of you. And I guess just to very simply sort of finish the question, what our main role is really to look at, for all of these companies, what they need to say to help their businesses be successful in the UK, who they need to say it to, and then how and where they say it, so the tactics they deploy to get their messages across.
Thank you very much, Joanna. And with your vast experience, so we've seen COVID-19 emerging, a change of communication, but that was within established communities in a way. So these were people we knew, our customers, our clients, our employees. So what kind of change or experiences have you seen so far? And what do you see in terms of the longer term developments in terms of communication styles and so on?
Yeah, okay, so I think as a brief introduction, I think for us as PR marketing and comms people, I really do believe that the sort of key pointer in all of this has been the communication. The sort of communication we've got, being on the receiving end of it, has really affected how we've all felt about our jobs, our employers, businesses, brands, our lives in general, our kids, education, all sorts of things. And I think we've all probably been on the receiving end of some annoying or astounding communication. I think we feel differently when this is our home. And so brands that I had definitely given permission to talk to me when I'm in the office, I do think there's a slight feeling that it's different when I'm at home, and I hadn't reset my permissions to hear from them, but I've noticed that I've reacted differently to them. So I think all the comms functions, whether that's, you know, maybe HR on the internal communications, because that's been hugely important, or marketing departments looking externally, I think they've all been under a lot more scrutiny than ever before. And although we're all in the same boat, none of us had predicted this, none of us have been through this before. And we're all under similar pressure, doing different, you know, the day job with different demands, with distractions. I think it has meant that mistakes have been more likely. Communication hasn't been as straightforward as previously, and it's tested a lot of companies. And I think for some companies, it's exposed gaps and shortcomings in the way that they communicate. So that's been, you know, a challenge. You know, we were talking just briefly, weren't we, before we started, about this feeling that we've all got now that we need to constantly communicate, that people are asking for answers all the time, whether that's an email over the weekend. But some of that feels quite normal to us as PR people, because we work a lot in crisis communications, and some have definitely adapted better. I mean, I would say from our point of view as a business, we are all in the cloud. We're already Zoom Teams users, we're on laptops, we work very strict processes with our clients. We have internal worksheets that we send every client every week. So actually, perhaps for us, it hasn't been as big a challenge. But I think some companies are still seeing challenges coming forward. The changing focuses on social, for example, is still challenging in terms of how do you communicate and how do you overcome some of those challenges that are around at the moment. So I just wondered whether I could ask you back what your members have been telling you so far about their experiences, or what impression you're getting about communications. And
I think in terms of our members, it is a bit varied. I think the ones in the service industry who are office-based, they have adjusted, I think, reasonably well in terms of their communication strategy. In terms of manufacturing, etc., that has become more difficult in terms of supply chain, etc., how to organize the work and the distancing requirements and so on. So they have different challenges. So I think the service sector has been better in terms of adjusting. But I think also what we feel now, as we are a bit further away in a way, of course, digitally we are there, you need to define your processes more clearly. And I think that's what we've seen being a challenge which company has mastered, but it's there that we have to be more reliable, processes have to be clear cut, and that is, of course, it's a change in terms of how you operate, and you have to operate maybe more in a way, so it has to be right the first time, and it's less of an ongoing work thing. So, and I think that's a challenge, and I think our members, they are worried about not the current situation in terms of interaction with employees and businesses and so on, and their existing customers. Is what about new customers? How do we actually create new relationships? That I think is a key issue which they are being faced with, where they haven't got all the answers yet, because that is a bit of a work in progress, but it's also where they probably feel they need some advice, etc., how to go about this, how to establish future relationships.
Yeah, no, I think you're right, and I think we'll make sure we touch on that later on. I'm just making a note there, but I think you're right. Service industries have found it easier. I mean, I think some of our clients have found actually just logistics, just in terms of, you know, did they have all of their, what we would call their stakeholders, all, you know, on good systems? And I think quite a few have actually suffered from, I've just realized that actually maybe their systems weren't as robust. So when they wanted to get in touch with lots of people, they didn't have it all in the right places, because suddenly their workforce was all over the place. And I think you could spot that at the beginning with people who weren't in touch with you as quickly as you thought they might be. So I think that has been quite different. And in terms of, we're always interested, how different countries react to different things. And obviously that's our job, is seeing what companies feel about from different territories. What do you think have been the main differences between UK businesses and German businesses that you've been seeing? Is there anything interesting or different? Or
yeah, if we look at the service sector, just to start off, I think the UK had more of a already a tradition of working from home, working remotely, being more flexible there. That, I think, was an issue for German companies right at the start of the outbreak of the pandemic, that they didn't have the technical feasibility or systems in place to have everybody working from home. And then, of course, you have Germany is a more regulated country. You have to ask your works council, etc., and you have to set up all sorts of guidelines, etc. Where I think a lot of service companies in the UK just made it up as they went along because they had to do it. And I think that took some office-based companies a lot longer to adjust to. And I think then Germany was luckier in terms of how the pandemic has developed. So it was, when I talked to colleagues in Germany, so very often there were at least still 20 or 30% in the office, which didn't happen in the UK. There's still most offices are still closed and people are working from home. So in Germany, that was never really the case to the same extent as here in the UK. And that's already coming back to the sort of normal, with in many offices being 40, 50% being back on a very regular basis. So I think that there has been because of technical reasons, but I think also because of the different curve in terms of the pandemic, that they have returned to a sort of normal already. So I mean, it's the new normal is not yet there, but it is a bit back in its own ways, and maybe in the UK the change will be probably more profound in terms of how companies will operate, because the UK has now been in 3 months in lockdown in whatever form, even with the easing up of the restrictions. And if I speak to other companies, they don't expect to be sort of semi-fully back in the office by the autumn or so. And if you speak to German companies, they have a different outlook in terms of the time frame, and there will be probably a more normal when they return than in the UK.
And also we're finding, I was talking to an organisation in Australia, and they were saying there's no way they're going to be travelling until next year. So I think that's going to change a lot. And that comes back to the point you were saying earlier about how do we find new customers. I think that's something that's going to definitely take a long time to work out and bounce back.
Joanna, if I can ask you, from your experience, you work with a lot of companies. Do you have examples who has been doing the right communications and probably some examples where it didn't go as well as it could be? So, because I think that's always interesting to hear for our members in terms of what they can learn from examples in the real world.
Okay, so I think as a generalization, I would say the ones that have done their communications well were the ones who really worked out who their stakeholders were, which had shifted for quite a few of our clients. For example, quite a few companies had pivoted their offerings slightly, so their stakeholder groups and who they needed to communicate had changed. And then I think the other thing that set those who did it right versus perhaps those that are struggling a bit more was to look again at their messaging. So, you know, were they, had they got the right messages for the right people? And that had changed. So I personally, again, just sort of felt quite a few people who were in touch with me at the beginning, their messaging wasn't really what I wanted to hear. And I thought that was quite interesting. They had, you know, there was suddenly a flurry, we all got them, I'm sure, which was the notes from the CEOs and things like that, which is appropriate for lots, but not for everybody. And I thought that was messaging that had gone slightly wrong. And also those companies that had stuck to their values and really worked out, you know, and knew inherently what is important. So you could spot some who hadn't got off the mark very quickly because there were gaps, whether that's on their social media or as I say, emails that just resonated slightly wrong at the time. But I think there are two examples that we, certainly in sort of PR and comms, we've talked a lot about in our sort of groups. And one of them was Waitrose, which quite early on came out saying that any worker who is forced to self-isolate because of infection in their family would have to make up their hours at a later date, which actually was interesting because it was different to what John Lewis was saying. And these, as you know, two brands that are very well known, very well regarded, and they got a lot of criticism. And they came straight back with, basically saying, we're sorry, we got it wrong. We've listened, we're going to change our policy. Of course, they no longer have to time bank it, and they'll be on authorized paid absence from day one. So I think, again, if I go back to sort of crisis communications, when you're under pressure, you come out with a statement and maybe it wasn't right. And the thing to do, if it wasn't right and you decide it wasn't right, is get out there very quickly with it wasn't right and we've changed, rather than letting it sort of hang around. And I would contrast that with Hiscox, which again has been a really interesting one and is still in the news today, literally today, with there's some legal action where their whole story. So this is where I say be true to your messaging. Their whole story over years have been based on, relationships are based on trust, and if you've made a promise, you keep it, and we insure you, and when something bad happens, we'll make you sort you, make you work again. And they sell business interruption, as lots of insurance companies do, to a lot of small companies. Their key sort of market is small companies, covering financial loss if they were unable to use their premises. And they then actually refused to pay out because of COVID-19, because they said it was actually not, the policy wasn't designed to pay for the likes of that, but it was more like, say, if there was a Legionnaire's disease outbreak on the business premises. So they came out saying, no, we're not going to pay out. And, I think from a comms point of view, there's a real opportunity when you've got a story like that to think, well, maybe that isn't the wording, but it would be important for us to do the right thing. And they've stuck to their guns. They haven't reversed that decision. And they're getting a lot of attention at the moment. I think their shares fell quite a bit, and they've now got this class action lawsuit happening. So I think those are two sort of public examples, and I think there's lots more under the radar and in between those. But I think from as I say, drawing a similarity with crisis communications, if you get it wrong, which we can all do when we're under under stress, then you just correct it, and then actually the way you handle it says a lot about you as a company as well. So yeah, I think some people have done it well, some people not so well, and a lot in the middle who are still finding out how to do it and are still testing and trying out new ideas, I think.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think, as one always say, in a crisis, you see who you can rely on. So, and I think these are, on a personal level, on a business level, I think that's always key, and that's what we find out. And it's also our feeling in terms of our membership. It's really values we should have had in the first place, that they become more important because we have less interaction or different interaction. So it has to be clear what our values are. And I think what we also see is, let's say, we deal with higher levels of uncertainty, as I always say. So my sister is my sister-in-law is a medical doctor in an intensive care unit, and she always says, we will have to live with higher risks because the medication might not work fully, vaccine might not work fully. So we live with uncertainty. So we need values. We need to have trust, and I think that is important, especially on a distance. And we can see that COVID has made times very dreadful for a lot of people and individuals, and also on business. But can you also see some businesses who have made a positive, or on which it has in a way a positive impact, that they could actually drive things forward and create innovation and so on? Because I mean, in crisis times, there's always a chance to develop something new and get some big leaps forward. So despite all the huge costs and the loss of life.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think there have been some very good examples of innovation. I think, as I say, we work with a lot of tech companies, and I think tech companies have found it sort of, I wouldn't say easier, but have found it more in their nature, in their DNA, to keep thinking about how do we need to change things. We've had some of our clients go into mask manufacturing, which is completely out of their field of knowledge. We've had others give space for key workers accommodation, so just using up their spare space. We've had one of our clients who's a chatbot company. They've sort of given all of their chatbot technology over to a checker, a COVID checker, not so much in terms of symptoms, but in terms of have people been, were people distancing and self-isolating, things like that, which is all feeding into government information. So I think some companies have really done some great stuff. But I think you're right. Your point at the beginning is, none of us can ignore the fact that the world has changed. And so I think some of the things that companies have done is try to rethink how their brands are still relevant, because otherwise you can seem irrelevant, and it's about sort of having empathy with what's going on. And I think that's why, in a way, people are not going to say, we know, as you were saying, we're in a new normal, but we don't even think that's the new normal. We don't know what that is yet. So I think people are still thinking about what is still going to change, and, are not going to be too quick to say it's sorted, we've ticked that box, because I think we're all very well aware that behind, where we are today is a whole history of some really sad stories that have gone on. One of the things I think we found interesting from a comms point of view is obviously that, we had a few laughs at this right at the beginning between sort of comms people is Brexit disappeared off our list of topics. But I just wonder whether that's, we're starting to see it obviously come back a little bit into the UK. But again, from your experience and your members and what you think's happening, how do you think this is going to play out over the next few months?
Yeah, I think Brexit is creeping up the agenda again. It even gets reported in the media every now and then, and negotiations do not appear to go well. I think both sides are having their positions, and it's very difficult to move on them for whatever reasons. Very, very difficult to judge. And most companies now fear that there's going to be a hard Brexit. And even if we are lucky that there is a free trade agreement, it will at best be a bare minimum free trade agreement. So that means no customs tariffs and no quantitative restrictions, but the rest will be left open and will still need to be decided. So that we see an extension of the implementation period is highly unlikely. The government still sticks to its gun and says 31st of December. And there was an article in The Economist on the 2nd of May, and it said, so the government is not in a good position to deal with COVID-19 because most of its cabinet members have been chosen on their enthusiasm for Brexit and not for their competence. So, and I think that's a damning judgment by The Economist, which is, I would say, a capitalist newspaper, which tends to be more friendly towards the Conservatives. So I think it's really, that's the hardline position of most of the ministers. If you look at the four great offices of state, it's the Prime Minister, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Foreign Minister, and the Home Office Minister. So they're all Brexiteers, and therefore there is less room for flexibility on their side. And maybe it's so some darker characters might even think that they always want to sweep it under the COVID carpet. So because we'll see a huge economic downturn because of the coronavirus crisis, and maybe let's just get it over it at the same time. So, but I think sometimes they assume that it is a relationship where you can subtract one from the other. But I think Brexit will probably at least add or multiply the coronavirus effect in terms of supply chain interruptions, in terms of reduced demand, in terms of inequality, which we will see rising again as a part of the coronavirus, because many people will lose their jobs in the lower end of the pay scale. So I think Brexit is very much on the agenda for companies, especially the regulatory field. If you look at the chemicals industries, for the automotive, it's the supply chain. For food industry, it's where do you get the workers from, and then also where do you get in the care sector or in the healthcare sector, where do you get the workers from? So they are all worried, and it's coming up the agenda again with the coronavirus, companies having adjusted to it to some extent, and they fear it's just be another hit on top of the huge hit of the coronavirus. So I think they are getting worried more and more, and everybody hopes that there will be some kind of agreement between the EU and the UK, but I would say it's less than a 50% chance, far less.
Yeah, and I noticed as well in one of the things I've read that they're also saying that negotiations are more challenging doing it virtually, which was quite interesting. Whereas the rest of the world is saying we've got to get on with this and we've got to learn how to use Zoom or whatever else and make it work. There was an article a few weeks ago saying, but it's really challenging doing it without face to face, which I thought was interesting
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah. It comes back to what you said about COVID-19 in terms of values and also in terms of trust. And trust isn't really there to the extent necessary between the EU and the UK. The EU doesn't trust the UK in terms of the Northern Ireland Protocol, and the UK doesn't trust the EU in terms of being slightly more flexible and actually being willing to make a few compromises here and there. So I think that's a problem. And then if you have Zoom negotiations, sometimes you need to have the personal interaction. You need to crack the joke on the side just to somehow get the mood going and find a personal linkage to people. And I think, that's a challenge for the negotiations, which will make them even more difficult than they are already. And therefore the outcome might be even worse than it could be.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's, I think you're right. It's starting to move back up. And it's just becoming a segue back into one issue from another. So yes.
Yeah. And when we have smaller companies who haven't done really much communications work or marketing before, what do you think now is for them? Is it a good time to start with this now because they have less of a chance to reach out to people? And what should they be starting to do in terms of getting a proper communication strategy or marketing strategy in place?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess my default position, anybody asking me that question, would be yes, you should always communicate. I suppose that's what I believe in. I think it's going to be really important to getting those messages correct is going to be even more vital, making sure that they resonate well with what's going on in the world. So I think, yes, you should, companies should be putting out regular communications. I think, as you said, and it's going to be a challenge. How do you build trust with companies, particularly new stakeholders for companies, when you aren't perhaps going to be able to see them or meet them as much? And I think, we need to think how we help companies get in touch with people, build that trust when they can't do it in a face-to-face way. And I think one of the ways that you do that is by stepping back and thinking, for yourself as a business, what have I really got to offer? Who's now is going to be interested? Be authentic about it and be consistent. I mean, I think the whole authenticity play around COVID and how, we are quick to judge what we think now is, insincere or wrong. I think businesses are going to find that has more of a knock-on effect on them too. So I would say, yes, start communicating. I mean, I know there are some great deals going around in terms of online marketing pricing and things that weren't around before. So that to some people is a real bonus if they are wanting to test out new sort of communications in terms of online, for example, and advertising. But I think you just want to make sure that you don't get dragged too far away from your core purpose and mission. I think it's going to be more difficult for people to understand you when they can't physically see you. So, everything, I think people should be looking, if they haven't already, be looking at their websites and just rethinking, is this still current and relevant? Does it need some new wording for different things? Not so much news announcements of what we're doing during COVID, but just really thinking, what has changed and is this still relevant? So I would be saying, sort of to a certain extent, for everybody, going back to basics, which doesn't have to take a huge amount of time, but back to basics. What am I trying to say? Is it still relevant? Why will people want to listen to me? Where will they want to hear from me? And answering all of those questions, it's a good time to replan and rethink that now, I think.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, you mentioned so communication is important. That should always be taking place. So, but then, what is more important? Is it the message or where you deliver it? Because I think channels have changed and so on as well. Sometimes you have a message, but you deliver it to the wrong people. So where do you see that should be the focus upon?
I think, I suppose I think that the wrong message will be wrong wherever you publish it. So if it's wrong, it's going to be wrong, whatever methodology, wherever you put it. But then if you choose the wrong delivery method for it, the right people won't see it either. So they sort of go quite hand in hand. I think, there have been some businesses that have looked more at different things. So social media has bubbled up for some companies more than it used to. And I think there's been more, people thinking, well, which social media is more important, what topics are sort of traveling more on this social media channel than others. So I think those, you know, going back to what we were saying about earlier, those that have really thought it through and watched and seen what's happened have really thought about it. I think for me, I noticed on LinkedIn, I'm still not sure why people would be publishing news about their birthdays. I personally don't find that and LinkedIn the right place to do it. But there are all sorts of things that people are looking at. But I think it's really about, you know, making sure your emails, for example, if you're doing email targeting, is really the right time. I'm on the receiving end, which I'm sure a lot of people are, of sort of generic, the repetitive emails, you know, that comes through saying, oh, you haven't responded to my last one 3 days ago. And I really wonder why some people didn't go in and put, you know, stop this campaign. This is not going to work in this day and age. You know, people do not want to hear about, whatever it might be at the moment. Just back off and do it again. So I think how we perceive what we've been on the receiving end of, or what we notice, whether the messaging or the method that's been distributed, depends how we feel about the brand. And how well engaged we are with the brand, and by that I mean corporate or consumer brands as well, so that, you know, it's much more obvious what people are saying to us and why I would want to hear it. So I think that's been really interesting. I'm just going to end the poll, guys, and then share the results with you, which is that actually I think pretty much everybody here says that they think their company's communications has been really good, well run and effective, which is great news. I think that's not what we found out with a lot of other clients when they've been asking questions of their customer base. So that's interesting. So thank you for that. Yeah,
I think that's a good sign. So at least our community believes in itself. So
yeah,
really,
exactly.
that they are doing the right thing. And of course, there will be minor glitches and so on. But I think that's also my impression when I talk to our companies, that they are quite pleased with how they've reached out to people, how they've stayed in touch with people.
Yes.
But then, and I think, but looking forward, so things have changed, as you've already mentioned, but really what is important in terms of what change can we expect for the future? It's the issue which we've already touched upon. How do we get new customers? How do we get new employees or new stakeholders which we want to reach out to? How do we get to them? How do we actually communicate with them, and how do we reach them? And any advice on that you can give us?
Yeah, I think there definitely has been a shift, sort of the way that companies and brands, or there will be a shift, want to communicate. So I think, you know, in the last few years, there was a lot more about ethical purpose. Sort of had, you know, people were talking much more about that from companies alongside, you know, brand or product promotion. And that's definitely something that's getting a lot more talked about now. So I think whether companies are specifically in that space or not, I think there's a growing recognition that you're going to be judged on your behavior rather than simply your statement of what you're about. So I think some people have been saying, you know, it's a time for business, not brand. It's, you know, it's about a company's behaviors as opposed to how it markets itself. So I think that's true. I think that is going to shift. And I think people are going to have to think more and more about, you know, how they describe their businesses, how they talk about their businesses, what their businesses stand for. I think that's going to be really important. And I think the other thing that's going to be perhaps more pressure on us for at least the foreseeable future is this continuing feeling that we're in a situation that we haven't been in before, and it's lasting a lot longer than we thought. I mean, you know, not because we thought it was going to be all over and done with, but when this sort of crisis hits, you don't know, do you? It could be this amount of time. It's now this amount of time and going. And I think that's going to be quite challenging. I think there's going to be a lot of, you know, replanning, thinking about it, making sure it's, you know, everything you're saying is still consistent with your overall brand, company. You know, checking in almost every week. Is this still relevant? Is this still good? Are we still saying the right things? Not rather than sort of ticking that box and thinking, well, we've looked at it once. I think now would be the time to be looking again and again at what you're trying to do and who you're trying to talk through. So I think, you know, the type of communication we were talking about sort of the virtual age, and I think that's going to be something that we're going to keep looking at in terms of, you know, how we can be authentic and appropriate at every stage as we go forward, as whether it's business brand or consumer brands. I think that's going to be something that's going to be top of our list for you know, certainly in the next few months, and in some ways I hope for a long time. Actually, I hope this does change some of the ways that we think about our corporate brands and what we do with them. So and I had just one thing in terms of type of communication. I had one question came through to me from LinkedIn from one of the your chamber members, which was about meetings online and this sort of thing, and saying, do you think people will use them in the future more effective, efficient, green communication, or do you think we'll resume, you know, with the traveling back and forth for in-person meetings? So I had already gone back on LinkedIn saying I think there's a sense that face-to-face is always best for building relationships and trust. But we've all got used to these virtual meetings. And I know from some of our clients, you know, actually it's lowered the barrier for them, because the market entry barrier, because, you know, they don't actually have to be here because nobody is here in London. You know, go back a few months, there was always that feeling, come up, tip up, network, get known by people, but they've just had to do it all virtually. And in many ways it's sped up their business. So they've sort of entered the UK virtually to begin with, rather than anything else. So I think that's been quite interesting. So for some companies, it's really worked. But I wondered again what you felt about that. And do you think we'll all bounce back to sort of travel, apart from the expense, which I know has got put quite a few people off at the moment?
I think we're probably not going to travel that much in future on business. And my feeling is also, and from our member companies, our communities and other companies I talk to, is in this more virtual age, it's more difficult to create trust, as you've mentioned. Yeah. So you haven't got that many chances to get it wrong. So because I think mistakes will always stay longer in people's minds, and it is more difficult to build up trust. So if you make mistakes, you have less time or less opportunity to correct it. So you really have to be more careful with your messaging, and people are more careful and simpler. It is what you've mentioned: authenticity and honesty, and also talking about the value added, which might change quickly over time, or over just a few weeks, or over a few months. And I think that is a challenge in terms of the communication going forward. And we recently had a webinar with a company from the freight forwarding sector, and I think what came out of that, so in a way we will have communication probably in future with the not key accounts. That we will have more communication, more direct interaction, but with the smaller ones they will be more automated communication. And in terms of was one insight I got from that. But what is your view on that, in terms of the direction of communication in this virtual age, in terms of the different customer segments? So because we'll have to probably also stay more efficient or become more efficient, because cost pressures will be there, and will we see different types of communication, or in terms of different direction of communication, depending on the importance of the customer group or the stakeholder?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think everyone's become a lot more demanding and about communication. So I know, for example, when somebody tells me, you know, as an SME, I know that you want to get everything online, I think to myself, no, I don't. So you know, to me that sounds sometimes like you know, a reason for putting it all up on a website or something. And I think, no, I don't. I want to talk to people. You know, for me, that is important. So I think it will be difficult to generalize. I think you're right. People are going to have to segment how they pull their various customers together. I think that's going to give rise to a lot more sort of networking, collaboration between different sort of pockets of stakeholders and groups, which I think is good. I think there could be, you know, I think some of the things that have been set up during this period where people are sharing a lot more information and swapping, you know, I think that's going to continue. I can see that for a lot of business companies, that idea about hosting sort of mini sessions for its clients and its customers where they can share their own experience, I think would be really welcomed. And I think it's going to be difficult how, as you say, how do you segment people, and maybe the key customers get more attention, but you don't want the smaller customers to realize, you know, they're not part of the key customers. I know when we've worked before for companies, you know, trade associations, they always sort of had, you know, we're the large members and we're the small members, and that sets up automatically a real between the large and the small, going, the large get too much attention, and then, you know, and the large are saying the small get too much attention. There's a lot of sort of conflict in that. So I think it's going to be evolving and asking what's really important going forward to people. But I think it will depend, as you say, on the stakeholders. You know, some sort of communication I think has really changed. I think people are expecting to interact more, just because, you know, they've been on, you know, I don't think Zoom's changed everything, but, you know, they've been on these calls where they have been able to ask questions and get instant answers. So I think in a way that's going to continue. And I think the challenge for companies is going to be, how can we do this in a cost effective, as you said, time effective way, so that we're not just constantly on calls and sharing information. I think it's going to be something that's going to have to evolve. People are going to have to work out a completely different way of communicating with stakeholders. I think that's going to definitely change going forward. I haven't seen anybody doing it yet, I don't think, that I've noticed, but yeah, I think that's changing.
Yeah, because that what we see also, our experience, we have a higher level of transparency these days, because the world has become more virtual, mistakes become more easily visible, and I think the messages probably also need to change, because we have, as I've already asked it or mentioned beforehand, so we have less of a chance to put things right, or we will not given another chance. So in terms of how maybe messages need to change in these times, so to actually reach out to people who have changes in demand and how they want to be approached, how they want to be communicated with.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I know sort of, I think there might be a shift, for example, for call centers. I think it's going to shift in terms of people. I mean, I know that I found it quite difficult getting through to, well, I was, you know, if I want to be annoying, I always say, could you tell me your customer complaints department, as opposed to, you know, customer, whatever, care department. But I think there is going to be a shift about how we work with people. I know one of our clients is sort of saying they think live chat's going to disappear, because actually live chat, although it sounds brilliant, a lot of people, and I'd put myself in this too, have found live chat actually has been really annoying during this period where we're used to more. So I think there will be a different way that we sort of talk to each other and communicate. And I think that's all sort of into the melting pot when we're looking at, you know, the paid, owned, earned, shared media version, and sort of thinking which tools are going to be more important. I think that is something that all companies are going to move on to doing, and think about, you know, what now might work, and have we got the internal capability to do it, you know, and can we build a plan around it? Because I think that's going to be different. We've seen, you know, different sectors of the industry working well. Again, our client, this one's called Lido, you know, did some research. Construction felt they were behind the times in terms of being able to deal digitally, whereas other companies felt very good. London and the Southeast were very, you know, confident that they had reacted really well when lockdown first happened, whereas the East of England, companies in the East of England felt they hadn't reacted quite so well. And then I think you've got other things which are interesting, like Twitter saying, you know, people can work from home forever. And then you've got Facebook saying, we think half of its employees will work from home, you know, in the next 10 years. So how do we cope with all of that in terms of great communication? And I think we've been able to do it now in a relatively short time frame. But, you know, we're all going to have to think, how do we carry that on with, even if, you know, 50%, as you were saying, do get back into the workplace quite soon. I think some people are not going to want to do it. So how do we change that? I think is going to be a challenge for lots.
And will we see in terms of the type of communication, in terms of changes, will there be more pronounced in terms of business to consumer communication, or more in B2B communication?
Well, I think one of the interesting things is that I think a lot of sort of historically, a lot of things that we thought are very B2C type tactics have shifted more to B2B. So I often think now companies think of themselves as brands as much as the brands that they might promote. And I think that's going to stay with us. So I think there's going to be a lot of companies thinking more broadly about their communication. So maybe, it used to be, say, if you take something like lead generation, maybe it was, email, automated email, and that works very well. But now you're going to have to think differently. There aren't going to be trade shows or as many. There aren't going to be conferences in quite the same way. So how are you going to make that work? I think there's going to be a lot of innovation coming up in the next few months about how we make business work in a slightly different way. So I think there's going to be a lot that's going to shift. But I'd say for both, whether it's B2B, B2C, perhaps B2C always instinctively thinks consumers will have changed. Definitely habits will have changed during this lockdown period. How do we respond to that? But I think smart businesses will be thinking exactly the same thing and thinking, and there's been a different tone, a different language that maybe businesses have been using, which is a little bit more, as we were saying earlier, a bit sort of more empathetic. Is that going to stay, or are we going to shift back again? So I think there's going to be a lot of people looking at what they're doing and thinking, how do we make this work now?
Yeah, thank you very much, Joanna. I'm just looking at the Q&A section here, and I see that one question. Aside from COVID-19, there is the big movement in the past week with Black Lives Matter, and how should business communicate and support it, or how should they react to it? And sometimes they don't really know how to deal with it. Any advice you can give us or businesses on that?
So we have had a few of our clients react to this. I think it's been interesting, again, that there's been sort of general chat about the fact that because we are all in lockdown, because we're all more aware that maybe what has been happening has been more easy to join in with, easier to get involved with. And I think that's probably true. I think it has to come back to, what your business, what your business is, what it's about, whether it's appropriate. The one thing I think everybody really dislikes is what they feel it to be insincere or jumping on a bandwagon for whatever reason. But I think if you have got something to contribute, if your stakeholders feel this is something you should be contributing on, then it is really important to get that right. But again, I think, some of the work we did with a client a couple of weeks ago now, or maybe a week, 10 days ago, you don't actually know what the end result is going to be either. So you have to be measured in what you're saying at each stage, so that you're not sort of either over-promising or anything else. It's really important to be, as it is with any sort of anything that comes towards you, just sensitive to where does it fit within your organization. Why are you right to comment on it? Are you right? Why are you right? And then making sure that you give that information correctly.
Thank you. I'll just have another question here. So we have kept pretty quiet during lockdown, but need to re-engage with our customers as lockdown eases. How do we make that switch? And also maybe just an add-on, how do we now get new customers in this sort of lockdown easing? So how do we approach them? I think that's a key issue for many companies who need to grow their customer base in any case.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think for new customers, I think it's a question of looking at, as we said, sort of that target sector of your stakeholders and what they are now doing. So it may require you to actually start talking to these people more about what are they going to be doing, how are they going to be working. I think the ones where I know that we use chatbots and things online, and we use a lot of social and a lot on LinkedIn and email too. I suppose we look at all communication, trying to work out what companies, how they want to hear from us, but also what they want to hear. And I think that has shifted a lot, and I think will shift. So for new customers, I think it's really sort of taking a step back. Where do we think these new customers are coming from? I always say it's really useful to look at what's happened in your industry as a whole, what your competitors have been up to. You get a lot of clues as to, now is the time perhaps to take a look. And often companies are concentrating only on what they say and what they're communicating, but actually look around you and what's changed, you know, what's your industry saying, and where do you fit in within that, and sort of engineering yourself and working out what you've got to do to find those new customers who may be coming from different areas that you've not thought of before, or different sectors that you've not thought of before. And I think, you know, that again is important to make sure that you're offering that, whether it's on your website. So for example, you know, if your key sectors have only been these, or only this size of company, maybe you need to rethink whether actually there's more to be offered here for different sectors or different areas, and that needs to be reflected. It can be really annoying if your website says one thing, your LinkedIn says another, and yeah, that's annoying in normal times, but very annoying when you're trying to find that out for the first time as a new customer. So I think that's definitely got to change. And I think getting back in touch with customers with appropriate information. So again, I go back to what I was saying earlier. I think some people got in touch with me telling me things that I just really wasn't interested in. And that's difficult because you don't know, but you've got to take a judgment call. Does everybody want to know, you know, X, Y, and Z? Or will they be interested now that things are starting to ease a bit, you know, when timings are going to shift? I would say probably yes. A lot of customers will be interested in that. So I think that's important to, hopefully you've been communicating. So you're not switching from, you know, silence through to over communication. But I think, you know, if you have been sort of doing less, now is the time to re-engage with people, asking for them to feedback to you. I think it's changed. It's a bit more like social. It's more, you're looking for interaction. You're looking for, we want to respond to what you're feeling, what you need, you know, how can we do this? So I think that's going to shift in B2B, particularly into being more of a conversation, I hope.
Yeah, thank you. And then in terms of media communication, so I mean, that's also my impression, probably many other people's impression, is that the first 2 months of the lockdown, it was really COVID-19 stories. So
yeah,
and is so if you are a large company and you want to communicate some new developments and so on, is there the right time for it now, or should companies wait for longer because it's still very much COVID-19 is the media, getting all the media attention at the moment?
I think it slightly depends sort of which media, which sector you might be in. So we're finding quite a lot of, we were doing some work regionally for a client, and you know, a lot of journalists were saying we are up to here with information about COVID. We're looking for something good to talk about now. You know, there's only, I think from their perspective, you know, there's only so many pages we can fill with COVID stories. In terms of business, I'm not talking general news. So I think it does depend. Each journalist and each publication will be slightly different. We've certainly found, you know, they've had the impact themselves. A lot of journalists are on furlough. Some publications are thinking they might not survive. You know, so actually, you know, they've been affected as a sector as well. But I think it really, it comes down to which media you're going to be talking to and why, and have you got something relevant, you know, for the journalist, but behind the journalist, you know, their target readers, you know, is it something that genuinely they want to hear about now? Is it the right time? And that's a decision that companies are having to take at the moment.
Yeah. I'm coming here now to the last question, and we are slowly coming to an end as well. So the last question I have is in terms of communication these days, which is more internet based and so on. So the comments or the announcements you make, they remain there forever, and it remains traceable over many years, and this might hamper informal communication too, which is also very important. So it's the transparency issue there, which is I think not a worry, but it is something companies should be concerned about, what they communicate, because it's all going to be there for much longer.
Yeah, and I think that's a sort of a challenge that has happened in the last, you know, few years, particularly. Yes, that what you say stays there and is out there, and you know, you can see it a lot. We find it a lot. You know, a journalist will pick up a story that ran before and go, I'm just going to rerun this, or even using old photography or old, you know, visuals, because they found it online and they've started it. So I think there is a danger of that, which is why it's always important to you know, make sure that everything that you're telling people now is relevant, what has changed. So Very simply, for example, for some clients at the moment, the notes to editors sections you see on press releases, we've shifted those quite dramatically because, you know, they're no longer quite so relevant as they used to be. I think it's really making sure that's important. But yes, I think companies are going to have to re-engage with their employees a lot in terms of their policies about what gets talked about where, how, you know, and how that's going to change going forward. Because I think it will definitely have an effect in the future.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Joanna, for your insights,
thank
and thank you for everybody who asked questions and
yes.
for taking the time out to listen to us. What I take back from this really, it is what we live in uncertainty time. Trust becomes more important, really looking at the value added, looking at your purpose, that really is important, and communication is critical. It has to be transparent, it has to be of empathy, and it is really putting a challenge, I think, on all of us who need to communicate with our different stakeholders, really to be there, to be honest, truthful, trustworthy, and reliable. I think as uncertainty will be with us, so people need some kind of reliable positions. Yes, we're allowed to make mistakes, but we have to correct them, and then we'll be not forgiven. But it's possible to do that. But I think the tolerance for that will go down. That is something what I take back from this seminar as well. So really, once again, thank you much, Joanna, and I'll give you the final last word.
No, thank you. No, I think you're right. I think what you summed up there about you know, trust going forward. How do we rebuild? Not because we as individual companies have lost it, but because the world has changed around us. And I think the most important thing is if we can find that time to step back and just think what's changed, and then just retweak some of the things for going forward. Because I think, you know, we usually say to our clients, messaging should be looked at regularly, and stakeholders should be looked at regularly. But I'd say I would make that more regular than we used to. So just because things are moving and shifting, and I think, you know, business needs to react to that, to how people feel, how consumers feel, and how other businesses feel. So yeah, more work to do, unfortunately, as we all work from home. But,
okay, thank you very much, Joanna. And we are here at a webinar of the German British Chamber of Industry and Commerce, and the Germans have a reputation for sticking to timings, etc. It's 14:59 now, turning 1500. So thank you very much for all of you joining us in this last hour. I hope that was of benefit to you, and I hope I will see many of you again at our next webinar. So thank you very much, and everybody a good afternoon. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joanna.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay, bye.